Okay, so we can get started. Again, a warm welcome to everyone to this UNIDIR and UNODA event. I'm Sarah Erickson, a research assistant with UNIDIR's WMD and space security programs. I thank you all for joining us so much. And at the outset, I just would like to inform everyone that the event is being recorded and it will be made available afterwards on the UNIDIR YouTube page. I'm pleased to first pass the screen to the Director and Deputy to the High Representative of Disarmament Affairs, Adedeji Ebo, to open the event. I want to thank you for being here today, Ade, and the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I am delighted to have this opportunity to provide some opening remarks on the topic of outer space security. In the past 10 years, we have witnessed a dramatic increase in the number of objects launched in Earth orbit and beyond. The rapidly expanding use of outer space present significant opportunities to address a number of societal challenges, including the furtherance of the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. On the other hand, we face a difficult geopolitical climate. In the absence of trust and agreed norms, a number of states are developing counter-space capabilities, accompanied by policies that envisage active hostilities extending into outer space. In the absence of trust and agreed norms, technologies that could bring clear benefits to all of humanity could be misperceived or intentionally misused, further fueling a potential arms race. The failure to achieve progress in this area could imperil the access and use of outer space for generations to come. Yet, our existing governance framework remains insufficient to prevent outer space from becoming a domain of active hostilities or as a launching point for attacks against other space or terrestrial objects. That is why outer space was prominently featured in the Secretary General's seminal report known as Our Common Agenda, and why Policy Brief number 7, which was issued in May this year, was dedicated to the future of outer space governance. The various approaches that have been proposed for preserving outer space as a realm of peace should be applauded. These approaches should be seen as complementary and mutually reinforcing. This essential logic underlies the recommendation of the Secretary General, who has called for member states through UN disarmament bodies to develop with the widest possible acceptance international norms, rules, and principles to address threats to space systems, and on that basis, launch negotiations on a treaty to ensure peace, security, and the prevention of an arms race in outer space. I may add, the question is what determines the widest possible acceptance? And this question reminds us of the primary role of member states. The positive outcome earlier this year in the UN Disarmament Commission was an important achievement. The outcome of the open-ended working group on reducing space threat through norms, rules, and principles of responsible behaviors was regrettable. Yet it held productive discussions, advanced new ideas in an open and inclusive setting, and fostered new North-South partnerships. The Office for Disarmament Affairs believes that the goal of preventing an arms race in outer space can be best achieved through a comprehensive intergovernmental process that allows for the full exploration of all approaches. This should also be based on the common understanding that voluntary political measures can form the basis for consideration of concepts and proposals for legally binding obligations. I therefore welcome this event as a timely moment to delve deeper into how various approaches and proposals can indeed be complementary. I hope your discussions today build common understanding in this regard and positively influence the design of the next steps for multilateral efforts to prevent an arms race in outer space. And finally, while governments must lead the development of measures to govern outer space, non-governmental actors are playing an increasing role in this domain. They can play a supporting role in seeking and implementing new governance arrangements. We will continue to support efforts to facilitate the participation of commercial actors, civil society representatives, and other relevant actors in the work of outer space-related intergovernmental processes. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for sharing your remarks, Ade. I would like to follow up before we get into the discussion with a little more context and follow up on what you were saying. So space security, as you know, is of growing importance as all states become increasingly dependent on space-based systems. And these critical services that are provided through these systems make life on Earth as we know possible. They help feed, educate, and protect us. So it's important that outer space remains peaceful. However, we are currently living in a time of considerable geopolitical tensions, and outer space is not immune to this tension, unfortunately. Now, this is compounded by the rapid and continued development and diffusion of new space technologies, including counterspace capabilities. So in turn, this could lead to instability and unpredictability in the outer space environment. Now, to address this challenge, as we have talked about, and as Ade mentioned, states have proposed multiple initiatives. And the complementarity between these processes, such as the OEWG and GGE, which we will get more into, and any others that may emerge, could benefit from further exploration to build common understandings and work towards effectively achieving space security in a mutually reinforcing manner. So with that and those contexts, I really like to jump into our discussion now. To first state, I do want to know that the Q&A will be running throughout the discussion, so you may submit comments and questions at any time during this event. We just ask that you use the Q&A function that's at the bottom of your screen. We'd also ask for you to please indicate if your question is for a specific person on the panel or to the whole panel, and if you would like to be attributed, please type in your name and affiliation as well. So allow me to introduce our speakers. Today we have joining us three wonderful experts on space security issues. We have Jessica West, Senior Researcher on Space Security from Project Plowshares. We have Guoyu Wang, the Associate Professor and Dean of the Academy of Air, Space, Policy and Law, the Beijing Institute of Technology. And we have Almudena Azcarate Ortega, a researcher for the UNIDIR Space Security and WMD programs. So if we can start off with this discussion, Jessica, if you don't mind, I'd like to start with you. So although space security dialogue under the UN framework has been ongoing for decades, it seems there has been a renaissance, if you will, of discussions more recently. So could you set the scene for us and walk us through maybe the processes that have recently transpired, what is upcoming and what may be coming, drawing from even the first committee discussions that have happened recently?
Absolutely. The whole world is paying more attention to space now than ever before. And I think behind all of that is a necessity to be committed to continued peace and security in outer space. And this has really been emerging as a core diplomatic priority at the United Nations, I would say, in the last maybe 5 years or so. When I'm done here, I'm going to plop a link in the chat to a timeline of space, peace, and security initiatives, because I think it's important to realize that, yes, there's a lot happening now, but we're also building on a long foundation of efforts that states and civil society have built before us. So as most people might know, prevention of an arms race in outer space, known as PEROS, has been on the UN agenda for more than 40 years. And it's largely been a stalemate, at least in my interpretation, between those seeking a ban on weapons in space and those who are concerned with weapons or other harmful capabilities aimed at space and space systems. And it's kind of been a tug of war. I would say over the decades, though, there has been a coming together in several instances over efforts to pursue transparency and confidence building measures, most recently this year at the UN Disarmament Commission. So bravo on consensus that was achieved within that forum. But more recently, there's been a flurry of diplomatic activity aimed at creating more substantial agreements. We see this in the first instance with the 2018-2019 Group of Governmental Experts process that met to consider substantial elements of a potential legal agreement on arms control in outer space. And this was largely based on a draft treaty first proposed together by Russia and China in 2008 and again in 2014. So the effort here was to sort of unstick the conversation on this. And a similar group is set to continue that discussion this year, starting in November and continuing into next summer. And then a second effort to sort of unstick this stalemate on PEROS was initiated by the United Kingdom in 2021. And the focus here was to explore the breadth of threats to space systems and how they might be mitigated, not through restrictions on hardware, so to speak, but through norms of responsible behavior, through good conduct in space, and how that might inform a future legal agreement. This group met 4 times in 2022 and 2023 through an open-ended working group that just concluded in September. Neither of these processes produced consensus outcomes, but they have both spurred political declarations that reflect their core approaches to PEROS. And I think it's important to recognize these as well. There's the No First Placement of Weapons in Space initiative, spearheaded by Russia, I think over a decade ago now, which has over 30 signatories. And more recently, there's also a moratorium on destructive tests of direct ascent anti-satellite missiles initiated by the United States last year. And I think at last count, it has 37 participants. Now this year, fast forward to this year, we have proposals for 2 different open-ended working groups ahead of us. One would continue the conversation initiated by the United Kingdom on norms of responsible behaviors in outer space and try to arrive at more substantive outcome. And a second one would focus on legally binding aspects of PEROS, and that is being sponsored by Russia. And so, despite this flurry of activity and meetings, in some ways it's hard not to feel like we're still kind of stuck where we have been before. But I don't want to leave you with that impression, because I think really where the renaissance is not so much in meetings and meeting rooms and whether we call them Group of Governmental Experts or open-ended working groups. It's really the maturing of the debate. And I think that is really evident in 2 ways. First, the concept of space security and how I'm not a diplomat, but you in the diplomatic community are talking about it has really evolved. We're no longer talking vaguely about weapons. States are now talking about kinetic interference, non-kinetic interference such as cyber, harmful environmental implications of weapons testing, activities that drive arms racing behavior such as poor communications and transparency. States are talking about humanitarian links to space systems, critical infrastructure, gender, race, geography, socioeconomic status. So I think that we are faced with a much richer debate than we have ever had in the past, and that's positive. And second, we see a maturation in the growing number of states that are engaged in diplomacy on this issue. I think the report on the open-ended working group listed 70 or more state participants. And at First Committee, every year, we're seeing more and more states actively participating in debate and offering suggestions. And I think civil society is part of that as well. We at Plowshares used to be one of the only non-governmental organizations engaged on space, peace, and security issues. Now we're part of a community. And I just want to give a shout out to the work UNIDIR has been doing on this as well to mature the debate through production of the lexicon, the space policy portal, the dossier reports. I think it's an incredible time to be engaged on this issue.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for sharing those insights. A lot that you've shared. You also said you would put into the chat for some of our audience members to maybe catch up on that, because there is a rich history. So in that regard, the space community, we're not starting from zero. But I do want to take a few steps back, because in a sense, we've been talking in UNEs, if we will. There's a lot of acronyms and there's a lot of heavy kind of diplomatic processes. So Alma, if I could turn to you to unpack kind of what are these concepts? What is an OEWG? What is a GGE? How are they different, and how do they support each other? And following that, if you could unpack for us maybe the mandates of these adopted initiatives more from the OEWG and the GGE on Paros, and if you will, how do you see them as being complementary?
Absolutely. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, Jessica, because I think that you gave us the perfect sort of like baseline to continue with the discussion. So going on to your first question about what these acronyms or these different groups mean or entail, OEWG, as Jessica already mentioned, stands for Open-Ended Working Group, whereas GGE stands for Group of Governmental Experts. And for those not familiar with these different processes, this might not mean anything at all. So let me delve a little bit more into it. The OEWG, which, as I mentioned, stands for Open-Ended Working Group, keyword open here, is, as the name itself says, an open process to all member states of the United Nations that wish to participate, but also to non-governmental entities. So as Jessica mentioned, in this recently concluded OEWG on reducing space threats through norms, rules, and principles of responsible behaviours, we had multiple states, and there were also several representatives from industry, academia, and civil society that took part in the proceedings, including Project Plowshares, which was represented by Jessica West here. The GGE, on the other hand, is a closed group. It's limited to around, well, the number can vary, but it's normally limited to around 25 experts who are nominated by the states that they represent. So you might have a mix of diplomats or non-diplomats, like, for example, professors, but they are still governmental experts, so meaning they have been nominated by states. Whereas in the OEWG that I just talked about, those civil society, academia, and industry representatives, they don't have any affiliation with any state necessarily. They are there on their own to represent their own interests. So all GGEs that we've had so far that deal with space security, and there have been three, one in 1993, another one in 2013, and another one in 2019, have operated on the basis of consensus, meaning that all of the members have to agree on the report in order for this report to be presented to the international community at large at the General Assembly. In 1993 and in 2013, the GGEs, which dealt with issues related to transparency and confidence building measures, reached the necessary consensus to agree on a report. And these reports were, in the respective General Assembly sessions, submitted to the body of the General Assembly. In 2019, as Jessica already mentioned, the group did not manage to reach a consensus, and therefore there was no report submitted to the General Assembly. As for the OEWG, so far we've only had one in when it comes to space security, and this process also operated on the basis of consensus, and as Jessica also mentioned, it failed to reach a consensus on either a substantive or a procedural report. I will say that although these groups are different, you cannot really say that one group is better than the other one. both have advantages and both have disadvantages. So for example, when it comes to the OEWG, one thing that states and even non-governmental entities have really liked is that it is an open process, that it's very inclusive, that everybody can participate. And as states and other stakeholders become increasingly aware of the importance of space, this inclusivity is something that's appreciated. On the other side, something that the GD is very good for is efficiency, and also the fact that every single person in the room is an expert, which might not necessarily be the case in the OEWG. So that could make reaching consensus, so that could make negotiations somewhat easier. So as you can see, both have the pros and cons, and it's not an issue of choosing the best tool, but rather to make the most of these different tools that we have and ensure that they can be used in a complementary manner. Sometimes they can be seen as incompatible or mutually exclusive, and not just the processes themselves, but also the goals that they seek to achieve. So for example, in these two recently approved processes, so the recently concluded OEWG and the GD that will be starting in November. So here I'm going to start answering your second question, Sarah, about the mandates of these two processes. They have, of course, different mandates. And so the OEWG that just recently concluded, the end goal of this OEWG was to make recommendations on possible norms, rules, and principles of responsible behaviours relating to threats by states to space systems, including, as appropriate, how they would contribute to the negotiation of a legally binding instrument, including on the prevention of an arms race in outer space. And it would do so by also taking stock of the existing international legal and normative frameworks. It would also consider future and current threats to space systems. And it did do all of this throughout the 4 sessions that took place in the span of 2 years, in 2022 and 2023. But unfortunately, it did not manage to reach a consensus in our report. The upcoming GD, the mandate is slightly different. So instead of focusing on norms, rules, and principles, its mandate is to consider and make recommendations on substantial elements of an international legally binding instrument on the prevention of an arms race in outer space, including inter alia on the prevention of the placement of weapons in outer space. So as you can see, this GD is very much focused on reaching recommendations and making recommendations on a legally binding instrument, whereas the OEWG that just concluded was more focused on these normative frameworks, norms, rules, and principles. These two approaches, non-legally binding and legally binding, have been traditionally seen as incompatible or mutually exclusive. But I feel, and I think, Jessica, also you talked about this as well during your remarks, I think this myth or this dichotomy, so to say, has been proven to be slightly false. They are very much compatible. And discussions throughout the whole OEWG process, I think, highlighted this very clearly, not just because the mandate of the OEWG mentions both these normative frameworks, but also mention the negotiation of a legally binding instrument, which is a first in space security discussions. But also because if we look at the history of how tools and instruments for space security, sorry, not for space security, but for space in general, and even beyond space, in disarmament more generally, have been crafted, you really can see this complementarity. So for example, let's take the example that I always like to use is the Outer Space Treaty. The Outer Space Treaty, which is the basis for every single law and regulation, both at the domestic and the international level that we have, was actually born out of 2 UN General Assembly resolutions, which are non-legally binding tools. And also this complementarity works the opposite as well. So you have established legally binding principles in the Outer Space Treaty, like, for example, in Article 9, you have a principle of due regard. And this principle was further developed in COPIOs through the long-term sustainability guidelines, for example. So you really see that these different initiatives can really support each other. I think I don't want to take too much time. I think that the last example perhaps that I would mention on this complementarity, which was also highlighted by Jessica in a way, was that it doesn't even have to be you don't even have to have a treaty to see this complementarity, but also norms can also lead to the creation of customary international law without the need of states to actually sit down and negotiate a treaty per se. And we're perhaps seeing this a little bit with the initiatives that Jessica mentioned. There are several non-legally binding initiatives like the No First Placement, spearheaded by Russia, which is around 30 states that have made this commitment, if I'm not mistaken. And we also are seeing it with this commitment to not carry out tests of direct descent kinetic ASATs. So these could eventually be in the midst of creating the necessary state practice to eventually transform into customary international law. And we might see them become customary international law, or we might see states deciding that they want to sit down and actually make them into a treaty or different treaties. So I think that this idea that these different measures are directly opposed or incompatible is very much a false dichotomy. And I'm very pleased to see that states are also coming to this conclusion through the work that they've been doing in space security negotiations. So my hope for the GGE that's about to start is that states will continue to work on this complementarity, and they will rely on the work that has been done in other instances, in other processes, to ensure the success of this upcoming GGE. And I will leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Almo. You've thoroughly answered the question, giving both, the theoretical explanations of these UN processes, but also more of the evidence of what the mandates are, what took place, and how they can be and are complementary. I want to turn to Goyu though for starting to delve into the practical experience and what took place and what can happen. So, as someone who has worn multiple hats, in regards to these processes, drawing from your experience as an expert within a delegation, but also from that non-governmental academic perspective, how can participants ensure that the processes are mutually enforcing? What ideas and recommendations that came up in the OAWG do you think will be progressed and can be progressed in the GGE?
Thank you, Sarah, for the floor, and just good day to all our distinguished delegates in the room in New York and our colleagues online. So I also thank Amu and Jessica for their presentation, which just hopefully make it easier for me to answer these two questions. So it seems that, we have the renaissance, in this domain, but I'm afraid we're still facing many challenges about how to reconcile these different initiatives to better serve the common goal of Paris. So one of the main challenges is that the basic logic of this, say, OEWG and GGE, these two initiatives are different. So one is based on dichotomy of responsible, irresponsible, and another is subject to illegal approach. Say Paris GGE is supposed to recognize the legal elements about space behaviors on the Lex Lata and the Lex Ferenda. So personally, I believe people should be less struggling and sensitive, again, hopefully, to discuss about application of existing international law than to create new moral standard to determine what kind of space behavior can be taken and what should not be taken. But again, personally speaking, some discussion on the OEWG are still useful. For instance, delegations more or less exchange their views regarding legal matters, just like Amu mentioned, like how to determine the use of force and armed attack in space domain, the application of due regard principle, authorization, supervision obligation under space law, the application of state responsibility law, and the applicability and application of international humanitarian law. However, it is a shame that such discussions are not in the deep and the systematic manner, since some delegations believe that this OEWG is to define responsible or irresponsible behavior rather than the legality of specific space behavior. So just keep all these in mind, and in order to better reconcile these two initiatives, at least the two kinds of common recognition or understandings must be achieved among all delegations. So first one, reconsider what should be the fundamental objective to guide all Paris process. I believe there would be no disagrees about that everything we're doing on the Paris agenda is to keep us away from space conflicts, particularly armed conflicts, and to avoid misperception, miscalculation among states. If so, it means space stability should be recognized as a common goal to guide the process of any initiative regarding space security governance. Subsequently, it means any behavior, excuse me, which might lead to misperception or miscalculation between countries should be examined as a threat to space security, including but not limited to hostile national space policies, statements, unfriendly or provocative space operations, lacking of necessary extent transparency when conducting space missions, etc. However, whenever talking about a space threat, people always refer to space debris or so-called, it's mentioned by several times today, counter-space capabilities. I'm afraid it does not touch the essence or nature of space security issues. Space debris could also be generated from a space traffic accident, say it's unintentional event. Obviously, then it falls into the category of space safety and it should be taken care by copious. As to jamming, spoofing, laser dazzling, cyber interference in space, ASAT tests, such kind of counter-space capabilities will not be big trouble anymore if there are no hostility among countries. Therefore, as to the delegates in Geneva or in this first committee, they must be kept in mind that space stability is the fundamental goal of your work. Although space sustainability, frequently mentioned, is desired as well, but I'm afraid it's too ambitious to achieve by Paris process, since it's not only about security matter, but also about safety concerns, which is the matter of copious again. But we must also be aware that stability is the prerequisite of sustainability. So fight for security and stability in space is the, I would like to say, historical duty of delegations in this committee and in Geneva. So second, seeking for common recognition about the correlation of soft law and hard law. I'm afraid that there's still some misunderstanding there, which would not be conducive to reconcile these two initiatives, and it would even undermine the process of space security governance. People might just take it for granted that OEWG to reduce space threat is a soft law approach and GG is more about a hard law approach. As a matter of fact, it's not necessarily the case. Some rules in the soft law document could also be legally binding. I would like to take 1986 remote sensing principle as an example, which is a UNG resolution, of course, but some articles in it just reiterate or elaborate the relevant obligations under the Outer Space Treaty. Apparently, it is not appropriate to argue that these articles are absolutely not legally binding only because they are contained in the UNG resolution. Likewise, some rules in LTS guidelines or were proposed under this OEWG could also be legally binding as long as they come from the Outer Space Treaty, UN Charter, or could be understood as a treaty interpretation position of a country. On the other hand, hard law does not necessarily mean each and every article in the new treaty are 100% new obligations or principles. They could also be a specific interpretation of the existing general principle or obligations, like continuous supervision, due regard in the Outer Space Treaty, So the mandate, just as mentioned by you guys, the Paris GGE clearly expressed that to consider and make recommendations on substantial elements of an internationally legally binding document on Paris. So having said that, the term elements here not only comprise new principles, but also include the elaboration of existing legal principles. Therefore, delegations should be aware that the dichotomy of soft law and hard law, it is just a tool to evaluate a specific rule on the table, no matter it's contained in a treaty or a UNGA resolution or COBOS document, but should not be taken as an alternative approaches for Paris. As far as I'm concerned, the view as, I quote, one of the main divergence of the two camps is about soft law or hard law approach, the end of quote. So such kind of saying is just a pseudo proposition as to me. So in concluding, in order to ensure the processes are mutually enforcing, the most important one is that states should show their sincere political will to contribute to Paris, as well as the space security global governance. Temporarily, just please lay aside their political divergence, pragmatically and professionally seek for compromise, reserve space stability as the common goal of negotiations on any specific rules. In addition, please pay more attention to the interpretation of lex lata matters, reinforce the relevant discussions, during which we can finally perceive what kind of new legally binding or legally binding norms that we really need. So then come to the second question as to the ideas recommendation in the OEWG can be processed in the coming GGE. As I just mentioned, except the dichotomy of responsible, irresponsible, there are several takeaways could be considered by the coming GGE. First, the interpretation of treaties and general international law about specific space behaviors. For instance, how to define threat and use of force in space domain, how to elaborate due regard principle in specific space scenarios, how can prior consultation and other obligations apply in the case of jamming, spoofing, laser dazzling, unfriendly rendezvous proximity operation, ESA test, and any other sensitive space scenarios. And how can the law of neutrality apply to the involvement of commercial space activity in armed conflicts among other parties? And whether and how can HL apply in space armed conflicts, etc. Second, the clarification of critical terms. A number of terms has been preliminarily discussed in the OEWG, like space threat, threat or use of force, space attack, due regard. There are still some fundamental legal terms to be discussed, like harmful interference, harmful contamination, attribution under state's responsibility law, neutral obligation in space, etc. UNIDIR just published the lexicon for outer space security this year, and which could serve as a handy references for the relevant discussion in GGE. Third, TCBM and the verification measures. Among those proposed norms, rules, principles submitted by delegations on the OEWG, many of them are about the TCBMS. In addition, verification matters were also mentioned. The relevant matters could be still further, discussed on the GGE, like whether verification articles are necessary for a legally binding treaty, and what is the proper approach to establish such measures. Again, personally, I'm looking forward to fruitful and constructive discussions, in the coming GGE. I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Right, thank you so much, Goyu. You introduced even, the concept of space stability as a way to commonly frame these discussions, which I think is very useful. And then also bringing in that academic and that legal perspective, talking about hard and soft law, and really pinpointing how much more careful we should be in applying and thinking about these concepts, so that that way we don't, as you're talking about, continue either the false dichotomies or applying them in an incorrect manner. Alno, I want to turn to you because you're also somebody deeply involved in the OEWG process. And I want to pose the last question, that Goyu answered also to you, about what ideas and recommendations that you saw that came up in the OEWG do you think could be progressed and built upon in the GGE, and how can states ensure continuity of discussion?
Thank you so much, Sarah. Before answering your question, let me say I'm always really pleased to be on these sort of panels with Guoyu, because I too have a legal background, and I always enjoy being able to discuss the more legal issues in these policy discussions. And I was nodding as he was making his comments. One thing that I would like to touch on, which he mentioned about this dichotomy between hard law and soft law, and when he raised the issue of definitions. Even during the OEWG, so UNIDIR was part of the process and assisted the Secretariat by providing substantive support. And part of the role that we did in this context was we submitted several working papers throughout the whole process. I'd like to refer to the third working paper that we submitted, which dealt with the role of norms, rules, and principles of responsible behaviours, and the relationship that these tools have with legally binding instruments. I wanted more specifically to point to what we say in this paper about the definition of what norms, rules, and principles are. Traditionally, in policy circles, we associate these terms with non-legally binding tools, but in law, they don't actually have to mean that. And in fact, for different official languages of the UN, like, for example, Spanish, when you say the term norm or when you say the term rule, people, what they are going to interpret that you mean, unless you clarify, is they are going to think you mean a binding law. So I think during the discussions that we had during the OEWG, these differences really came up a lot. And they generated confusion, and I couldn't agree more with you about the need to clarify and reach common understanding on terminology. So I'm really pleased that with the Secure World Foundation, UNIDIR was able to put out that lexicon just this past August. I actually put a link to it on the chat. So for those of you interested to check it out, please do. Then to move on to your question, let me answer it by using the chair summary as the sort of guidance to answer this question. So even though we did not reach a consensus report in the OEWG, the chair did publish a summary, which you can find it on the OEWG's website, and I would encourage you to look at it. And I think it really offers a good indicator of what the concerns of the international community are. And in the recommendations section of this summary, at least part of these recommendations can serve as perhaps a useful foundation for the work of the GGE, because it's a good a good sort of taking of the pulse of the international community when it comes to space security at the moment. And there are several recommendations. If I'm not mistaken, there are around 9 recommendations, and I would further put them into 3 different blocks. So a first block of these recommendations was focused on the weaponization of outer space. I think this is a big topic for probably most states, and will continue to be an issue to be discussed in the context of the GGE. So there was a recommendation on avoiding damage and destruction to space objects, or using space objects as weapons, deploying and developing space objects for hostile purposes, also interference with the normal and safe operation of space objects. So a big focus throughout the OEWG discussions was, of course, kinetic ASAT use and testing. It led to these unilateral commitments that Jessica was speaking about at the beginning. And of course, kinetic use of ASAT it's to be avoided because of the creation of debris. As Guoyu mentioned, debris is not just an issue that comes up only due to intentional targeting of space systems, either in the context of testing or using. It's also something that can happen accidentally through the normal use and wear and tear of space systems. But it is even worse when it's intentional because it's entirely avoidable. So I think that was a big issue in discussions with the OEWG, and probably will come up in the GD as well. But I think states also highlighted that even though kinetic ASATs are the more flashy in the counterspace capabilities family, it's their non-kinetic counterparts are equally as dangerous. For some states, even perhaps more dangerous because they are, so to say, more insidious. They are easier to detect, to attribute their use to a specific state or entity. So that's a big issue for many states, particularly when we come to the issue of how legally binding mechanisms have to be for many states. So what I mean by this is that many states in the OWG, but also we saw them saying this in the substantive discussions that we just had at the first committee of the General Assembly in New York, where many states mentioned if we are going to have a legally binding mechanism on space security, we have to ensure that it's effectively verifiable. And of course, when it comes to non-kinetic activities, these can be harder to verify. And so I think that the GD will have an important task on its hands to define what verification is going to look like for non-kinetic counterspace capabilities, and to build further common understanding on what these non-kinetic counterspace capabilities can look like, the damage they can do, et cetera, et cetera. A second block of recommendations from the chair's summary was focused on protecting outer space through compliance with existing legal obligations. And Guoyu already delved into this in his intervention just now. So the chair's summary, it pointed out to the need to protect critical space-based services, to provide assistance and encouragement in certain acts, and also implementation of international obligations, commitments and measures more generally. If states, I say we, but I'm not a state, obviously. But if states commit to comply with existing legal obligations, like the Outer Space Treaty and the other international space treaties, like, for example, by registering their space objects, this makes tasks like verification, like protecting critical infrastructure, a lot easier. Also, when states are working towards creating new mechanisms or negotiating new measures, in this case for space security, I think they can fall into the trap of trying to reinvent the wheel and start from scratch. And this is something that they don't need to do. As Guoyu already mentioned, we do have a robust legal framework for space. We have the Outer Space Treaty, which has some very useful principles, and we should not forget that. So instead of trying to create the next new thing, I think it's also important to delve into the principles that already exist and try to reach a common understanding of what these mean. What does due regard mean, for example? This was a huge topic of discussion during the OEWG sessions. The Philippines presented a working paper on this, and several states talked about this. But there are many other principles. What does harmful interference mean? As Guoyu said, what would the use of force look like in space? So all of these things are issues that can be further explored, and they are definitely issues that that we need further common understanding on. I think that sometimes, that the tensions that emerge among states and that make space security such a high priority, they stem from the fact that these currently existing legal frameworks, they are interpreted in different ways by different actors. So there is a lot of perception of gaps that need to be filled, and they are sometimes filled through different interpretations of different actors. And so I think the GD will provide a really good opportunity for states to sit down and reach common understanding on these issues, to ensure that perhaps we won't end up having a uniform understanding of what these principles mean, but at least we will know, and this is something we try to help out when we publish the lexicon. At least, you know, states, when they sit down at the negotiating table, they should know what the other one means, so that they essentially speak the same language, so to say. And the third and final block of recommendations of the chair's summary was focused on the need for further transparency. So military space policies, doctrines, and strategies should be shared more openly. Notifications of defense and security exercise should be carried out. And also there should be consultative mechanisms established to inform other states or other actors what's going on in space. If, for example, a space actor is seeking to carry out an orbital maneuver, this should be notified in order to also avoid the potential creation of tensions. I think this increased transparency was a huge topic during the OEWD, but again, I go back to this need to rely on or to look back at what was done in the past. And the issue of transparency was, of course, a huge focus during the 2013 GD. It was also a focus during the 1993 GD as well. And both of these GDs reached consensus reports. I think it was during the first committee discussions on space that somebody said, it's great that these GDs were able to reach a consensus report, and that's something that states should be praised for, but something that we all have to become better at is at implementing those recommendations. So we have the chance in this upcoming GD to look back at those GDs and the results that they delivered and figure out how we can implement those recommendations as well. Even though the 2019 GD, as well as this recently concluded OEWD, didn't reach consensus reports, that doesn't necessarily mean that they failed. And I feel like both Jessica and Goyi touched on this as well. We cannot deny that the discussions that were had in those processes, both the GD and the OEWD, were very fruitful to move the topic of space security forward, to raise awareness about the concerns, the different concerns and the different priorities that states have. And this upcoming GD provides an opportunity to address those as well. And not just these processes, but also the initiatives that have been presented in the past, but perhaps didn't end up becoming a treaty or a measure, like, for example, the draft PPWT that I think, Sarah, you mentioned in your introduction. It might not have become a treaty, but it raised awareness of the fact that for many states, having a legally binding mechanism is really important. It raised awareness about the importance of definitions, about the verifiable nature of legally binding agreements. So we have a lot that we can use to move the discussion forward. We don't have to start from scratch. And I think that's something really positive and something that states should profit from as they continue to move discussions forward. And I will leave it at that because I know that we are a bit short in time. So I would love to see how the discussion progresses in the Q&A section of this webinar.
Rick, thank you so much, Alma. There's definitely a lot to unpack with what you said, and thank you for sharing so much of the insight. I do want to pass to Jessica because you did follow and cover the OEWG process as well. So if you want to chime into any of those concrete, recommendations that you might see going forward to the GGE. But I also want to do a follow-up question on something that you had mentioned earlier, because you talked about, the future of space security negotiations and what might be taking place of parallel processes. So I just wanted to get your insights on how to manage maybe overlapping efforts, or how to make sure that we best tackle this and make sure that it's efficient? And have we seen similar situations in other topic areas that you know of? So if you could touch on some of this, that would be great. Thank you.
Absolutely. I don't want to repeat too much of what Almudena said, but I do want to plug one of her key concepts, which is dual purpose. And I think there was a very rich discussion about that at the open-ended working group that can help advance the discussion at the upcoming GGE, particularly because a huge stumbling block on legal initiatives has been, what is a weapon, definitions, and how do we know? And I think that there was such a rich discussion about this at the meeting, and a lot of ideas I think that states can bring to the table now and maybe move it forward. So I think, Amo, this is your chance to plug your paper as well in the chat. Yeah, I think complementarity between initiatives. I think we also need to take a step back and remember that those of us working in the space security field also need to be aware of what's happening in other domains of activity. And on this one, I feel like sometimes we work a little bit in a silo in outer space. And I think it's important to look at the cyber domain, in part because cyber was a big focus of discussion at the open-ended working group, but we already have norms established, a few at least, through the 2015 Group of Governmental Experts on norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace. And I feel like we could also leverage some of these existing agreements from elsewhere that would have application in outer space. And so that is another area where I think we can also develop further complementarity. But to me, when I look at the cyber domain, I think a key lesson is that complementarity is not automatic. And so in cyber, also called information communications technology, ICT, we've seen a similar process unfold of having parallel initiatives, Group of Governmental Experts and open-ended working groups, both focused on cyber, on ICT, but from different objectives and perspectives. And I think it was unprecedented at the time. I think it was a little bit surprising for many people working in the field. And I feel like it's now setting a precedent for a way to move forward on issues where there's maybe not agreement on how to move forward. So we move forward through two different channels and we call them complementary. And the key point here is that complementarity requires work. We can't just say this will complement that. Don't worry about it. And so how do we make what we're faced with now in outer space, where we have, a proliferation in a good way of diplomatic initiatives? How do we make those come together at the end? And I think there's a few things we have to do. The role of states is key. We definitely need states who are engaged in multiple processes in good faith and being able to make sure that conversations aren't talking past each other. And so they can bring ideas from one group into the other. So having as much cross-pollination as possible is important. Brazil uses the term, middle ground states. I think Egypt's been a great state that has really participated excellently in different processes and can bring those perspectives together. So states, you're important. Diplomats, very important. I think civil society can really help with that as well, by being able to translate what's being said in one forum to another forum. I think if we're faced with open-ended working groups, there's more opportunity for that. But I think at the end of the day, we have to make sure that we're running towards the same goal. And I'm not always sure that that's the case. And I'm picking up on some of the threads from Goyu's comments. Sometimes I'm not sure that everybody means the same thing when they talk about Paros, or that the end objective is the same. And so I think going back to the Outer Space Treaty, to shared understandings of law, to shared understandings of obligations to one another, and to shared understandings of international law will be really important as an anchor. And again, I see that as those discussions take place in both forums. And so I think that can really help us along the way. But we need political will. We need to make sure that we are creating complementarity. It doesn't just happen. And I think the risk we have is that at some point you suddenly realize that we've had two fabulous discussions and we've created two visions of governance for outer space. There's a little bit of that in cyber, and I wouldn't want to see that happen in a domain that we all share. that we all value, that we all depend upon, and that we all really have a responsibility to protect, not only today, but for future generations. So I don't know, I think we have a lot of work before us. All of these things are hard, though, when processes happen at the same time. We've heard from a lot of smaller delegations who say, A, it's expensive to participate in multiple diplomatic forums, and B, we don't necessarily have enough people to split. We don't want to see families splitting because diplomats are constantly away and engaged in too many forums. And I think the human and the financial resource implications for a lot of countries, for civil society, I think these are really real concerns. And so at the end of the day, my preference would be to see, you know, a single process unfold that everybody can get behind and that can address the needs and interests of all states. And I guess the second best outcome is to really have those core diplomats make sure that different discussions are pulling together and that they have the capability to be in both of them.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for your input on that. Since we have had some questions from the audience come in, I do want to also ask a question from Lou Topfer from the German youth delegate, who asked that youth plays a substantial role, both as end users and as developers of technologies, and as a group especially vulnerable to the effects of space arms race, as he puts it. So how can we be and get involved as a stakeholder group in these discussions? So if anyone wants to first take the floor and answer this question, thank you, Lou, for the question. I see your hand's raised. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Sarah. So it's about engagement of civilian or civil society, in such kind of security discussion. Of course, OEWG would provide opportunity in theory, but my concern is that for non-governmental entities, no matter it's a space industry or research institutes, they're encouraged to better understand the security concern of those countries, because as my understanding, the priority or the main concern of like commercial space actors is about safety matters, how to be free from damage rather than free from threat. It's just a matter of the countries. So then it could be better, involved in the discussion among countries. Otherwise, it might be, I would like to say, but used as a tool, as to the political debates among countries. I just stop there.
Open the floor to either Jessica or Alma if you also want to touch on this question. Yes, Alma.
Hi, thank you. No, I fully agree with the person that asked the question. I feel that youth is particularly important precisely because of the point that they raised, that they are going to be those who are going to inherit whatever the current generation leaves them. So I do agree that it's really important that they be that they are given room to participate in these processes. And so for a process like the OEWG, of course, that might seem more direct because they can register to participate directly. But that does not mean that the fact that the GDE is a closed process does not necessarily mean that their opinions are going to be automatically excluded and that their voices cannot be heard. The GDE is going to have an intersessional period that is going to be open to everyone, whether you are a state that is not participating in the GDE, whether you are a civil society representative or a representative of academia or whatever, you are going to have the opportunity to have your voice heard in that forum. So I would encourage anyone interested, and not just youth, but in general, just anyone interested in this process to follow the UNIDIR website. We publish these sort of things. To follow UNODA, they also, they're also the organizers, the secretariat. So they are the ones that hold the most knowledge about what is going to happen, and they will publish information as it becomes available. So follow those institutions, engage with the UN entities that are involved in these processes, and also engage with associations that are involved in the topic of discussion, engage with your own state. If your state is participating in the OEWG, in the GDE, make your concerns known to them, and they might be willing to raise those concerns in the context of the GDE as well. If you are from a state that does not participate in the GDE, you can still do this. You can initiate cross-regional or cross how do you say them, cross-national, cross-regional initiatives. We saw examples of this, for example, in the OEWG. We had several states who don't normally work together, and we saw them working together for the OEWG. So if that is possible with states, who's not to say that that is also not possible with other organizations that are not states. And so if you carry the voices of many, it might be easier for states that are participating in the GD to become aware of what you're doing, of what your concerns are. Oftentimes, it's not because they don't want you to participate in these discussions or because they are not interested in your voices that you don't get to have them heard. It's because they might not be aware that you have a concern. And this is something that a Chinese delegate raised in an event organized by the UK last week in New York, a side event for the space discussions. He mentioned, sometimes civil society don't really know that this is happening, or how can they know, that if you're here, that's already a good step, but you can also tell other people that this is happening. But I think it's also the state's responsibility that they have to raise awareness about the fact that these processes are happening. And so it's a back and forth. Again, we come back to the word complementarity. It's an issue of the complementarity of different voices. So yeah, I don't know if this is a very clear answer, or it gives you like a very direct idea, but I feel like engaging with institutions, entities, states that are involved in this process could go a long way to making the word, your word heard, your voice heard, and the voice of whichever organization you represent.
Thank you, Almo. So I do want to allow Jessica to add to this issue once, but in addition to that, just to give the briefest of kind of final remarks or concluding thoughts from our panel, focusing on the discussions today, but also posing kind of the last question of, we have this concrete GGE process that is coming up, right, on Paros. And so how can stakeholders, or how can states really, take advantage of the resources and the time and the discussions that has been approved for this process? And how can they ensure that we achieve a successful outcome? So if you want to touch maybe on that, and just final remarks as brief as possible to all. So maybe I start with Jessica, if you want to share on that.
Yeah, I think we have to be focused on moving discussions forward. There's been a lot of overlap, I feel, between the previous GGE, the current OEWG, and most likely the next one. Some things should maybe be settled, and I'm going to plug international law applies to outer space as one of those. Let's move on. We need to advance and not argue in circles. But I think, I wish we could have a fresh start. Last year's statement, Brazil mentioned that we've sort of built these, they referred to them as mutually assured destruction clauses into our processes lately, where, we poke each other's eyes out with unanimity rules by withholding unanimity and creating the perception of a failure of a process, even if it's not so substantially. And, this sort of tit for tat. And so I'm not sure if we can maybe move forward in a different way. I don't know if there's an expression that's the opposite of an eye for an eye, but doing the opposite of that, really trying to commit to goodwill, and I think the spirit of consensus, which is a little bit different than unanimity in my mind, and making the most of the previous discussions we've had, and trying to build and not go back and re-argue things. So I don't know, I'm optimistic. I'm certainly eager to hear what comes out of the GGE. I think the previous one, from what I understand, was a very rich discussion. And if we build on that, it should be quite productive. And I know I was floored by the level of participation at the open-ended working group and the quality of the debate there. So I think both of these are really optimistic.
Thank you. The optimism, I think, is always needed and always welcomed. Go you, if you want to go next.
Yes, thank you. I would just try to make it briefly, so first, just show enough political will, just like Jessica mentioned, to contribute to international community rather than only seeking for individually or collectively strategic superiority in space through arms control platform in UN. Otherwise, it's just a waste of time and the resources of UN. Personally speaking, I like to see more serious legal discussions than political blames against each other in the coming GG. After all, outer space is unique to us, from which we can get nothing without coordination, cooperation, and collaboration. Thus, no matter how serious is the geopolitical tensions, we have to seek for common understandings in space, particularly common recognition about what is legal or illegal. It is a key factor to effectively and efficiently avoid misperception, miscalculation in space. In that, one state's legal position means predictability to others. So having said that, I propose briefly 3 principles. First one, comprehensiveness principle. So some argue that ASAT is the most urgent issue. Some express that hostile national policy weaponization is the biggest threat to all of us. Some concerned about all kinds of counter-space capabilities, some highlighted TCBM. But as far as I'm concerned, neither of them is an isolated issue and should be examined as a whole. And they might be regulated in a single legally binding treaty in future. And second one is equilibrium principle, just like mentioned by our colleagues. All kinds of voices need to be heard. All kinds of interests, particularly the interests of developing countries, must be taken care and reflected in any to be drafted documents in a balanced way. And last one is a self-restraint principle. Simply speaking, it means that all countries shall refrain from conducting unfriendly, provocative, and even malicious space behaviors, even if these behaviors are not expressly prohibited by international law. So last word, experts under the GGE are highly encouraged to strike for consensus, common understandings within certain scope with the spirit of sincerity, feasibility, and compromise in order to promote space security governance hand in hand. Thank you.
Thank you. And to end our discussion, Almu, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Yeah, no, I'll be brief because I feel like maybe Jessica and Goyu pretty much said it all. As Jessica mentioned, I am also optimistic. I agree with her that sometimes discussions tend to be a little bit repetitive. And I think the reason for this is a point that I made just before, that we tend to fall into this trap of trying to reinvent the wheel. And so if we relied more on what we already have, we would perhaps find it easier to move discussions forward. And to tie into what Goyu was saying, I too would like to see more clarity when it comes to legal concepts and terms, especially as the mandate of this upcoming GD will be on establishing a legally binding mechanism. It would be very useful to gain clarity on legal concepts and terms that already exist and that already bind states. As we try to create something new, it would be good to have a common understanding on what we already have. But again, I am excited for the discussions that we will be having in this GDE, and I hope it is successful, and it helps in move space security discussions forward even more. And of course, from UNIDIR, anything that we can do to assist the GD process, as well as states that seek to become more informed on issues relating to space security, we of course are at your disposal and make ourselves available to anything that you might need. And I will leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to all the panelists for a rich discussion. Now, to wrap up and close this discussion and add into it, I'd like to welcome Bassem Hassan, who is the Minister Plenipotentiary and Director the Department of Disarmament and Peaceful Uses of Nuclear Energy at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Egypt, and the chair nominate for the upcoming GGE on Paros. So Bassem, thank you so much for being here to share your thoughts and closing remarks on this discussion. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sarah, and allow me to express my appreciation to UNIDIR for organizing this timely event. As you're aware, the upcoming GGE on further practical measures on Paros will convene its first formal session in about 3 weeks. And it's really important to utilize all available opportunities to prepare for this process and to engage in discussions on how to enhance the potential for its success. One of the key challenges to the previous processes on Paros is that artificial sense of competition and contradiction between the existing approaches. Reaching a common understanding on the complementarity of the existing approaches is a necessary first step toward overcoming this misleading polarization. And I sincerely thank all fellow panelists for their very insightful and informative remarks on this particular aspect. It's important to understand why we have multiple approaches and whether having multiple approaches necessarily means that we must establish multiple processes. Paros has been agreed as an objective and set as one of the international priorities 4 decades ago, as one of the speakers highlighted. Nevertheless, controversies continue to persist, and 2 of the recent processes on this topic have been unable to achieve consensus on their outcomes. To break down the problem or bring it back to the roots, some states declared intentions and plans to deploy weapons in outer space. Other states responded by developing and testing significant and alarming anti-satellite capabilities and weapons designed to attack outer space assets. This buildup of military capabilities and counter capabilities portrays the typical dynamics of an arms race in a very strategic domain and represents a threat to peace, security, and sustainable development. There is no dispute that the existing legal framework remains relevant and provides an essential basis for future work. However, this legal framework is clearly incapable of addressing the unprecedented and growing threats surrounding today's outer space security, especially considering the rapid technological developments and the rising international rivalry and tensions. Experience has proven that legally binding obligations represent the most reliable and effective method to achieve the desired results in the realm of disarmament. Taking into consideration the strategic importance of outer space, its inherent vulnerability, and the magnitude and severity of the risk of weaponizing outer space, it is imperative to explore possible means to codify legally binding rules sooner rather than later, and in a comprehensive and realistic manner, in order to reverse these alarming trends and prevent an arms race from all of its aspects. Transparency and confidence-building measures or non-binding commitments may contribute to avoiding misperceptions and miscalculations, but they cannot address the increasing threats or represent a sustainable substitute for legally binding obligations in this domain from the security perspective. Without legally binding obligations, each actor will simply assume that its adversaries are developing weaponization capabilities and will try to cope by developing its own counter capabilities. To achieve the desired progress, there is a pressing need for a comprehensive approach which addresses all threats while preserving the existing division of labor at the UN system between processes that address security threats and those that address safety risks and ensuring their complementarity. The long-term sustainability of the peaceful uses of outer space and preventing an arms race or conflicts require rules for both safety and security. While there are important synergies and interrelations between safety and security, each pillar is distinct and requires a different set of tools. The arguments against a legally binding instrument on Paros are not so compelling, to be very honest. Appropriate definitions and verification mechanisms can and should be agreed upon through negotiations. And a holistic approach and a balanced approach is necessary for achieving the necessary progress. Building on what the distinguished colleague Goyo mentioned, I can bring so many examples of TCBMs that did form parts of legally binding treaties. They have been underpinned by treaties. Whenever you see a measure in a treaty that is not subject to a very stringent verification mechanism, or not subject to punitive measures in cases of non-compliance, you can simply consider that to be a TCBM in its essence, or a non-binding measure that is included in a legally binding treaty. Now, the situation that we're at is that the states that have declared plans to place weapons in outer space reject any negotiations on legally binding obligations and advocate that TCBMs, or norms for responsible state behavior, are the possible first step in this domain. On the other hand, the states that have developed counterspace capabilities oppose the responsible behavior approach and consider it a way to legitimize the weaponization of outer space under the guise that this weaponization could be conducted responsibly. The result, honestly, is a stalemate. And the only way to overcome this is a comprehensive and balanced approach that addresses both aspects with an overall agreement that the final goal is reaching legally binding obligations. The establishment of multiple processes on this topic could be misleading and counterproductive if we do not guarantee their complementarity in several ways. To bring you an example, the responsible behavior track was agreed upon based on an explicit understanding of its complementarity with the process of reaching legally binding obligations on Paris from all its aspects. However, in practice, we noticed that during the deliberations of the OEWG, several delegations strongly resisted any reference to the aspects of non-placement of weapons or to legally binding obligations in disregard of the relevant references in the resolution that established that OEWG. And this only reinforces the aforementioned doubts that I was referring to. Now, how do we prepare for the success of future processes, including the newly established GGE? And I think the distinguished panelists today made my job very easy with their very pertinent suggestions and recommendations. But in my view, the first essential step is to build on the existing wealth of knowledge and previous proposals and processes. Any effort should not start from scratch or simply disregard previous deliberations. We have dozens of relevant UNGA resolutions, the deliberations of the 2019 GGE, the 2023 OEWG, the recommendations of the UNDC in 2023, as well as the 2014 draft PPWD, and many other important documents in the context of the Conference on Disarmament. Next, we must be cognizant of the recent relevant developments and initiatives, such as the new initiative that calls for a moratorium on ASAP tests. It is also necessary to follow a holistic and balanced approach, as I mentioned, and address both the threats related to the placement of weapons on the one hand, and those related to the intentional use of force against outer space assets. Moreover, and perhaps more importantly, we must put behind us all the hard feelings that came as a result from the disappointing inability to reach consensus on final reports in the previous two processes, be it the OEWG of 2023 or the GGE of 2019. And consider this GGE to be a fresh start or a stepping stone that can make real progress. Member states must actively find ways to end the polarization and politicization surrounding such strategic topics. We cannot just wait for the winds of global politics to change on their own. And I think you would agree with me that history has proven that disarmament does contribute to international peace and security, and that the relation between disarmament and international security is mutually reinforcing, not the other way around. Last but not least, it is important to ensure the inclusivity and transparency of the relevant processes. For example, it would be very beneficial to invite all interested member states to submit their views and proposals in writing to the upcoming GGE so that they can be taken into consideration during the deliberations. And as was rightly mentioned by the panelists, in the intersessional open-ended consultations that will be convened in early 2024, that would be a marvelous opportunity for all stakeholders to take part. It's also important to ensure that we can benefit from the research and knowledge of the independent experts from the academia, industry, and the relevant NGOs. To conclude my remarks, I am pleased to report that the new GGE held a preparatory informal meeting on the 10th of October, and that the preliminary deliberations reflected a very reassuring level of commitment by the members of the group to constructively engage with this process and to strive to satisfy the mandate bestowed upon us by the General Assembly to the best of our abilities, without prejudice to the positions of our respective governments as indicated in our terms of reference. I thank you again for this very important and timely opportunity, and I took note of the many pertinent views and recommendations made by the panelists, and I look forward to interacting with you in the future on this very important topic. Thank you. Back to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Bassem, for sharing your insights and for also talking on the discussion and giving closing remarks to this event. I want to thank everyone that participated in our event today and that spoke. Thank you again to our panelists. Thank you to our audience for tuning in and engaging. And before we close, if I could encourage all of you to fill in our online feedback form. It takes only 1 minute. It's anonymous, and it helps us greatly improve our events moving forward. You can find the link in the chat or scan the QR code on the screen. We invite you to explore UNIDIR resources on space security related issues, which you can find through the link in the chat as well. And we would like to thank all of our UNIDIR donors who support our research and convening activities. I would also like to thank Qingwei Sui, our UNIDIR colleague who supported the production of this event. And a big thank you all again for everyone attending, and to ODA for helping co-sponsor this event. I hope you have a nice rest of your day, and we hope to see you in our next event. Thank you all.
Thank you. Take care. See you.